Okay. It's all pretty cash. It's with great pleasure that I get to talk to Stephen Hodge. We've known each other for years, but I don't know if we've done a formal interview since about 1994 when you were racing Milan San Remo as a new father.
Yeah, long time ago, Rob, I think.
Yeah. But you have remained in cycling, and most people who understand cycling in Australia would know your name. Just tell me though, just try to paraphrase what you're doing at the moment.
So while I was on the board of Cycling Australia for many years, I was actually kind of developing an interest in the population level aspects of the endeavour of cycling. You know, I mean, in Europe we know that a large proportion of the trips that people do every day are done by walking, cycling, public transport. In Australia that's unusual. You know, it's much more car-based. We're very car-centric here. So I became very interested in the sort of the population health aspects of being more active, about all of that stuff. And so about a decade ago, the Bicycle Industry Association's Cycling Promotion Fund, so where the big players of the bike industry were investing not just in their products but in making Australia a better place to ride a bike, they advertised to create or to respond to what they perceived as being a vacuum federally for policy in terms of you know, cycling being represented in the big policy agendas of government, right? My job after cycling, I've been a consultant in corporate affairs, public relations, which does involve some lobbying. So I went for the job that they advertised to establish a federal government relations operation, if you like, for transport cycling. So moving away from my competitive cycling engagement, I'd done many years on the board and I was very happy with, you know, the way that cycling had gone. So that's how I got into this whole other kind of side of cycling life. And the organisation, we're now a not-for-profit charitable foundation called We Ride Australia. We Ride Australia is actually the trading name for the Australian Cycling Promotion Foundation. So it's a charitable not-for-profit organisation, and we lobby for more money to go to bike paths, schools programs, safety initiatives nationally. We bring together all of the Australian bicycle organisations each year into a cycling summit, Australian Bicycle Summit. There's a 20-year program of cycling awards called the Cycling Luminaries Awards, where we recognise people out in the community who might run a program to get more kids riding, or they might be on an island in the Gulf with a small Indigenous school and they use cycling as a reward to get more kids engaged in school. You know, it might be a health practitioner who uses cycling to get more people active for their own health and so on. So it's a really positive engagement that I have with cycling, and it's what gets me up in the morning.
What's your riding consist of these days?
So I kind of have two separate lives with cycling. So I still love getting out on my road bike. I still go out I have a group of boys, you know, we're called Squadra Hodge. You know, that's from years ago. I actually used to do coaching programs, and that's developed into the best ever men's shed, if you like, for cycling. So I love getting out. We go hard twice a week, you know, I take them all out and we push ourselves. But then I have my e-bike, which I go to meetings on in a suit and tie, you know, a proper Dutch style e-bike. And I have a travel bike. I have a folder, a Brompton, that I take in a bag on planes. So when I arrive in the city, I've got a form of transport. So I'm trying to walk the talk. I just love cycling. I mean, you know, and someone of my age, I'm 57 now, if you don't keep active, your brain's foggy, you're not nice to your partner and your kids, and you have all sorts of health issues. You've got to keep your body moving, you know, and so that's what cycling's brilliant for that.
Yeah. Let's just backtrack just a tiny little bit, just for people who don't know the Stephen Hodge name, but you've done, like, you know, the sequence, but there's 7 Tours de France in your legs. 6 Tours de France.
Yeah, so 6 tours, 4 tours of Italy, 4 tours of Spain. That's 14 major tours. I rode for Australia in the Worlds 10 times, did the 1986 Commonwealth Games, the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. I rode as a pro in Europe for 10 years on this international circuit. I was team captain of the ONCE and the Lotus Festina teams, and just had the most wonderful career in cycling. Then came back, established my own business, if you like, with my wife, the corporate affairs PR consulting business. But during that time, I also put back by being on the board of CA for many years, and it was a period of great change, and I think we did a really good job, and I'm proud of that period. In that time, we organised the World Mountain Bike Championships in Canberra. We organised the World Road Cycling Championships in Geelong, Melbourne and Geelong, which I was on the steering committees of both those.
I attended your summit in June. It was excellent. Thank you for bringing all those people together. There was one speaker in particular who made a very curious but relevant and perhaps underestimated statement that congestion is our friend. You would remember the speaker, and you would remember the concept of how congestion is our friend. Do you want to just try and paraphrase that concept for this interview?
So the big issue in cities is congestion. As population is booming in the major cities, everyone's coalescing into Sydney and Melbourne mainly, but also southeast Queensland. Infrastructure development lags behind population growth. So we get people coming in, and the roads become congested before the governments have time to invest the billions in either new roads or public transport systems, trains or whatever. But what we also know is that that the more you build roads, all you do is make it easier for people to drive. So all you do by making big new roads is you get more cars, and they become just as congested because all you've done is you've shifted the balance a bit in favour of cars yet more, and and then they become congested in a short period of time. So billions of investment in roads is almost wasted, right? It's a well-known effect. It's called induced demand. So congestion is our friend because the moment roads start getting congested, people start looking for alternatives. So you get to a tipping point where it's not worth your time anymore fighting on congested roads. So then you start taking the bus or the train, or then if you're doing a short trip, you think, oh, maybe a bike ride's not so bad at all. I've only got 2.5 k's to my 2.5 k's to my workplace. In Australia, each day, 50% of all the trips that any of us do are 5 kilometres or less. 50%. That is a distance, and you can imagine less than 2 k's is still a very large percentage. So they are distances that can be very easily accomplished by many more people by walking to a public transport stop, by riding a bike or whatever. We know in Australia that of the 2/3 of Australians who are not currently riding a bike for transport, more than half of those would if it was safer and more convenient. All right? So there's a huge potential market out there for people to ride more for their short daily trips. It's huge. And my job, the holy grail, if you like, for me, is to get governments to realise the economic benefit, the productivity benefit, the health benefit of catering for that massive potential market for all of those short trips each day in Australia. And each day there are about 75 million trips each day, all right? All modes, all buses, trains, cars. People on average do about 3.2 trips a day in Australia, right? If you include biking, walking, public transport, to work, home from work, to the school, back, all right? So it's between 3.5 and 4 trips per day per person. That's why we're getting to 70, 80 million trips. The potential for us to change behaviour by making it easier to walk and safer to walk and cycle is huge. So there are clearly differences across the political spectrum in terms of what various levels of government perceive as their responsibility. So traditionally this has been a state and a local government responsibility, providing for cycling and walking and so on, and public transport. So we're getting an increasing awareness across the political spectrum of the value of making it easier to walk and cycle. Now, what happens in the next election in May 2019, we presume, will be very important, because the discussions have been going on for quite a while. We now need to see who's going to put the money where their policies are. We've had no dedicated investment in cycling infrastructure since the global financial crisis negotiations, when the Greens negotiated a $40 million bicycle path fund, right, which I helped them get. So I believe that we have a really good, strong case. We can do the economic benefits, we can do the productivity and the health benefits really clearly on this, and that's what we'll be working towards. And you know, through the work creating the summit, we've got a very powerful now consensus among all Australian bicycle organisations who come to the summit each year. We've got a very powerful consensus that we're going to get further by working together.
At this point in your campaign to raise cycling as a pastime, as an activity in Australia, do you look at the roads minister? Do you look to the health portfolio? Do you look to the sports portfolio? Which one do you lobby first, and then do they all cooperate to create to make a bigger picture or not?
Silos are really hard to overcome between the different portfolios. Our aim is to boost current funding from about 0.5 to 0.7% of all transport funding for cycling to at least the mode share. Currently it's 1.5% of all trips are done by bike. So at the very minimum, we should be getting the amount of funding that corresponds to how many trips are done by bike each year, up to a maximum of 5%. The United Nations has already said that national governments should be spending 20% of transport funding on cycling and walking, because it's so important for productivity, climate change, health and everything else. So our first port of call is the transport portfolio. That's where the money is for infrastructure. You can build it as you're building any new road, upgrading any new road. You can provide for cycling, change the lines a bit, make the safe, separated path. Health doesn't provide much money because they have a huge task with primary health care, hospitals, GPs and so on. But certainly more than 50% of the benefits of getting people more active by riding bikes are in the health sector in their portfolio, right? But the money is not so much there. Sport is quite good at the moment. The current Minister, Bridget McKenzie, has devoted in the last budget quite a few extra millions in participation funding, that is funding to get more people active. And we're looking currently at a national trial for a Safe Routes to School scheme. So there's a federal program, Smart Cities and Suburbs. We are looking at a scheme, to trial a scheme whereby we get funding to make fill in the missing links, if you like, on the paths and the separated bikeways that will allow kids to get safely to their own schools, because kids are not active enough in Australia, as we know.
Just quickly explain the award-winning initiative on the Sunshine Coast. Let's just, while we're talking quickly about children.
So Colleen Penny is the Travel Smart Officer at the Sunshine Coast Council. She got a great idea from Denmark where they use smart technology. They use Bluetooth beacons on the bikes and a reader in the bike shed at the school. And the child, they do all the normal bike ed and they have a program that teaches the kids to be safe and road smart. But the critical thing about her program was also that she put on Bluetooth beacons on the bikes. When the child arrives at school, the sensor reads that the child has arrived at school, sends an email to the parent saying Johnny or Jane has arrived safely at school. When they leave school and the beacon leaves the sensor area, an email is sent again to the parent saying your child has left school. It responds very directly to one of the key concerns for parents, and that is independent travel and whereabouts. And it overcomes one of the key barriers that stop parents letting their kids ride, independently to school. And that's a key part of our trial concept.
What are the take-home lessons from your experiences in Holland?
So clearly it's a concern that we're taking decision makers, mayors and senior bureaucrats and ministers and heads of Vic roads, for instance, who we've taken there. Clearly it's a concern that we're taking them to an environment that is so different to Australia. People say, well, that could never happen in Australia. So that is a potential problem for us to take people to the Netherlands. However, what has been amazing is that it is so exciting for people to see what they're working at in Australia, just the point to which you can get to. So yes, in the Netherlands they are doing so well at promoting cycling, and 50-something% of all trips in Utrecht each day are by bike. So yes, so they're now getting congestion problems on their bikeways, and they're having to scale them up, and they're having to create bigger and bigger bikeways. But hey, the Netherlands is the only country in the OECD, in the world if you like, where obesity is going to decline over the next 20 years, not keep growing, So what a great problem to have. Australia's a really different environment, and we don't deny that. Yeah. So, however, most of the big gains and the big results that we see in Australia are the same as in the Netherlands. The city of Sydney has double the rate of cycling by youth and children than the Greater Sydney area, because they've invested in some separated cycleways. 90% of the kids on the Burke Street public school walk or cycle to school now since the separated bikeway was completed. Infrastructure and the safe separated infrastructure, appropriate infrastructure for walking and cycling, changes people's travel behaviour. So we can still do the same things in our cities, which are growing hugely, all sorts of talk about population pressure over the next 20 or 30 years, in exactly the same way that Europe has done it, because we have exactly the same problems. 80% of Australians live in the big cities, right? We can have exactly the same level of, change in Australia that we see in Europe. There's no reason why we can't. But yeah, we've got a bit of a job to change minds and commitment and generate political leadership.
Yes.
That's my job. Well, how great is that? That's why I get up in the morning.
With a smile like that, it's clear that cycling has served you well. You talked earlier about your bunch being a rolling men's shed.
Yep.
Let's just touch on the mental health benefits. We've touched on every other benefit of cycling. I know over the school holidays I had some moody days and I got time on the bike, and literally at the turnaround point I was texting the family saying I'll be home but I'll be much better. Talk to me about how it serves you well. I mean, I know for me it just feels like I get the endorphin rush, I get the oxygen in my brain, and I think differently. Yeah.
So without cycling I would not be as relaxed and as enjoy life as much as I do. And from a global health perspective, it is quite clear that being physically active has a huge mental health benefit, has a huge direct and immediate physiological benefit. So, whether you want to walk or jog or cycle, it's brilliant. It's going to give you all an amazing level of benefit, And 74% of our children from the ages of 5 to 11 and 91% of our children from 12 to 17 are not physically active enough to meet the daily recommended requirements for physical activity. That means they are not physically active enough to ensure their own long-term health. So when we push federally for a Safe Routes to School program with all the smart tech and the mapping and the bike ed and all of that, we will have a significant impact on the health of future Australians if we're successful. It's another reason why I get up in the morning to do this,
Yeah. So you're not, you believe that the work that you're doing can get the net effect that you're after?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a long game. Lobbying is a long game. We have a very institutionalised car culture, which means that in all the state departments of transport, and in particular in the federal Department of Transport, they don't see their job as anything but building highways, ports and, stuff, all right? So it's a long game. We've got the evidence, there's no problem with evidence. We have to tell the story better. And more importantly, we have to bring together coalitions of the willing and large parts of the population. We have to sell it better. We can't not be successful because we are behind other OECD countries on many key indices of living. While yes, we win prizes for livable cities, well, yeah, not necessarily in all areas. Australians do not have the options to be as active and do not have the choice to walk and cycle as much as they do in other OECD countries, and we're suffering because of it.
Okay. It's a cycling interview, and we're in 2018, and it would be remiss not to talk about one of your indiscretions. And I know that we have spoken often about it privately, but your criterium circuit in Canberra almost lost its name, and it's because of a confession you made probably 4 or 5 years ago.
2012,
so 6 years ago, about something that happened 16 or 17 years earlier. I know you don't really want to talk about it, but I'm a cycling journalist, and if we don't speak about it, then people will fill the comments section with, well, what about his EPO era?
Sure.
So, given that we've talked about health and cycling and longevity, the first question that relates to your EPO use is, do you feel like it has a detriment to your current state?
No.
No.
It was under medical supervision. And there are many places I didn't go, if you like, because of potential health concerns that I could have and that other people did, but I wouldn't consider it. So, but the problem with taking prohibited substances is most athletes do not have the knowledge or the confidence to make those sort of decisions. And that's why it's so bad. And I've always been very, very clear about this. It's not a good thing, and I'm really glad that it's changed. And I think it is impossible for us to promote a sport where parents think, oh, my kids are going to have to take drugs to succeed. That is an impossible situation, and it's thankfully, I think it's not the case now, and it's still a wonderful sport. It doesn't rely on that to be a great sport. I see a difference in cycling performance now. I think it's quite clear the difference. Now you see all those, the little climber types who can do a big acceleration on a climb, but they can't sustain it. So I think it's quite clear, some of the change in people's physiology when they don't have access to use those substances. And of course, we know that there were serious health risks associated with, regulated use of them in the early days. And thankfully, I'll just say again, thankfully, we're beyond that.
Yeah.
You can't have a sport. I rode in a time where the test for EPO didn't exist. Thankfully, it does. I think it's for the benefit of all athletes and the sport that it's a lot cleaner now. And I got second that day, and a fourth another year, and I won twice as an amateur.
And you told me it was Armand de las Graves who was...
Yes, he prepared for months and months, and I'd just come off the back of the full season, the full racing season. I was nailed, but I had no contract.
And you also told me you had no EPO that day.
Well, no. You don't just take EPO for a single race. Here I was. I had a 7-month pregnant wife in the car behind me, yelling out the window. I had no contract for the next year because my manager had refused to talk about, you know, my next year's contract until it was so late I could not get into the budgets of any other team. I was highly respected as a team captain, and I felt like I was screwed. So I literally put my life on the line in terms of the effort that I put in. I literally was riding for the future of my unborn child and my wife and myself, you know, and she was screaming out the window, you know, she was out here somewhere, and just the minimum, you know, mechanic and a masseur, and that was it, you know, with just the sort of, it was a gesture to me, you know I'm flicking you, but you might as well go and ride the Grand Prix de Nation. And the last 5-8 kilometres, I was so emotional. I was crying on the bike. I was going, you know, literally as hard as I could go, but because of all this emotional stuff, you know, I was literally going balls out, to coin a French phrase, and as hard as I could, and you know, it was all coming out, you know, and that's what defines effort. You know, that's what defines the special moments in your sporting career. It's not what drug you took. It's you know, that was, I was extremely fit. You know, I'd done 2 major tours that year. I'd ridden probably 110 days of racing in a 250-day season. I probably had 33,000 kilometres in my legs for the season. You know, I was a machine, but I was an emotional one. You know, here I was riding for my future.
Yeah. I think the legacy of Stephen Hodge is the fact that yes, indeed, you were a racer, but it's your current job which is going to have a longer term impact.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Definitely. You know, that was, you know, my pro career was fabulous. Wouldn't change it for anything. But in terms of what's really important in this world, it's our children, it's our safe travel around our cities, it's changing the nature of how we move, mobility, for a carbon constrained future and a better planned city future, more sensible alternatives for transport than we currently have. And that's huge with our population, you know, growing hugely, you know, whatever we're going to be, 40 million by 2050 or something.
Right.
You know, if we don't make these changes, we are going to have a seriously declining quality of life in Australia.
And the bike can, in fact, make it better. It's a reality.
Well, it does already, yes, in some pockets of our cities. Yeah. It already does. We know how to do it. We just need a more sensible investment, you know, spread between the different modes of transport. Less on highways, more on public transport, more on cycling, more on walking. Our cities will be much nicer. They will be more livable. We'll have less air pollution, less noise pollution, and less traffic. Let's not forget that the countries that have high levels of cycling are 50 to 55 or 60% safer in terms of road deaths and trauma than we are. All right? Less of us will be killed on the roads if we do this better.
And that's the take-home message, and that's probably the way to stop the interview. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Why not?
Well, thanks very much for chatting. It's a pleasure.
Cheers, Robbie.